Dynamic routing helps you get better margins and maintain a stable quality of your routes without too much manual work. Let's take a look at a few basic examples of dynamic routing that will help you work on your own more complicated scenarios. Example number 1. I want to route traffic from a specific client to a specific MCC MLC by LCR. So here is what I'm doing. I'm adding a new choice, and instead of adding a statically manually selected product, I'm adding a formula. By default, the list of vendors allowed to take part in the routing is not limited. The only thing that must be there is a valid rate for the MCC-MLC code the message is going to. So it may be like 100 vendors, for example, and the system will consider all of them and evaluate their weight. So now we need to set up a formula. The Formula Values button will help us get access to the list of available routing parameters. We have a wide variety of different choices here. Client account balance, client rate, client ASR, and client DLR. The ASR needs a bit of explanation, I think. It has the same familiar name from the voice industry, but it's not exactly the same meaning. The ASR in SMS is the share of messages successfully accepted for delivery by your vendor in the total mass of message attempts sent to that vendor. So for example, if you have sent 100 message attempts to a vendor and for 50 of them the vendor responded with a good response code, the ASR is going to be 50%. And similarly, the DLR is the share of messages with the delivery report received. And similarly, you can play with the vendor parameters like the account balance, the rate, the ASR and the DLR, also the current time value, the random value in case there are vendors with a lot of similarity in terms of weight, and of course the margin. So the simplest formula ever is like this, just the margin, with no other factors. So the system will use this expression to evaluate the weight of every vendor with a valid rate for the MCC MLC 250001. And it will arrange all these vendors in the descending order according to their weight. So the vendor with the biggest margin will be number 1. Once again, vendors with a negative weight are not considered by the system for routing. But here we have a special case. The system has the embedded negative margin protection. So even if you create a formula like this, for example, where the result of the formula resolution is guaranteed to be positive, even if the margin is negative, the system will never allow an SMS to go to a vendor that will provide a negative margin. So the embedded negative margin protection is there at all times. Just one opportunity, one way for you to override that. If, for example, you have a commitment with a vendor and you need to push as much traffic to it as you can, even if the rate is with a negative margin for now. You can tell the system, okay, so I want to push traffic to that vendor provided that the margin is greater than, let's say, minus 10 cents per message, something like that. Only in this case, the system will allow a negative margin. But more likely, you'll use a condition of a different kind, quality related. So for example, the vendor ASR needs to be greater than 95% and the vendor DLR has to be greater than 90%. So the system will work like this. It will take the whole 100 of vendors with a valid rate for this MCC MLC. Then it will apply the condition to that vendor list, and only to those who comply with these conditions, the system will apply the formula and arrange the vendors according to the result of the formula calculation. If you want to, you can limit the maximum number of routes. This routing rule will return back to the switch. You can use the max routes parameter for that. If the formula you have built is more complex than this simple one, for example, you can work on something bringing together quality and margin, something like that. You can save your formula as a template, so next time, in the next rule you'll be creating with a similar routing approach, you'll be able to reuse the previously saved formula template. Another way to make your routing more precise is to limit the scope of vendors available in this routing rule. So by default, as I have mentioned, every vendor is allowed to take part in the competition, but you can explicitly tell the system that you want to make use of just these, let's say, 7 vendors, so that the system will apply both the condition and the formula just to that limited list of vendors, and will return back to the switch 3 most appropriate of them. But it may happen that under certain circumstances, one of these 7 vendors will set itself on top of the routing list for a long period of time, several days, a week, something like that, so that it will keep receiving all the traffic going through this rule, and then if all of a sudden that vendor, for example, disconnects you because of the negative balance or the route fails or whatever, you will find yourself in an unpleasant situation because you will not know anything about the quality parameters of other vendors on this list. So to avoid this unpleasant situation, you can use the test share parameter. For example, if you set it to 5%, that will mean that the system will take 5% of traffic going through this route and will distribute these 5% of traffic evenly among all vendors on this list. So each vendor will receive a certain small portion of traffic, provided that the margin is not negative. No negative margin messages. So all vendors will be getting portions of traffic from time to time that will keep their stats up to date, and the system will be able to dynamically rearrange the positions of the vendors on the routing list according to the formula stipulated here.